Imagine standing at the edge of the ancient world. The wind moves quietly across a flat green plain. The smell of salt and sea fills the air. And there, rising before you from the earth itself, a city, walls of stone, towers catching the last light of the sun, the sound of horses, traders, and thousands of lives being lived inside those great gates. You are not dreaming. You are standing in the year 1200 BC on a low hill at the edge of northwest Anatolia, in what we now call Turkey. And what you are looking at is Troy, not the Troy of movie screens and dramatic speeches, not the Troy of wooden horses and falling gods. The real Troy, the forgotten Troy, a city so ancient, so layered with time, so buried beneath the weight of centuries, that it took humanity nearly 3,000 years to finally remember what it actually looked like. This is the story of that world, the forgotten world of 1200 BC. Close your eyes for a moment and try to picture the Mediterranean in its greatest age. Not the Roman world you may have learned about in school, not the classical age of Socrates or Caesar. Go further back, much further, to an era so distant that it feels almost like myth, because for a very long time, it was myth. This is the Late Bronze Age, and in this era, the world was not a collection of isolated villages stumbling toward civilization. It was remarkably already deeply civilized, already deeply connected. From the great river cities of Egypt, where pharaohs still commanded armies and scribes recorded harvests in careful detail on papyrus, to the towering palace at Mycenae in Greece, where warrior kings wore gold masks and sent ships across the sea, to the vast Hittite empire in Anatolia, whose capital Hattusa contained a royal library with thousands of clay tablets. The Late Bronze Age was a world of extraordinary sophistication. It was, in many ways, the first global economy. Copper came from the island of Cyprus. Tin arrived from as far as Afghanistan, and perhaps even Britain. Grain flowed from Egypt. Olive oil from the islands of the Aegean. Purple dye from Phoenicia. Ivory and gold from Africa. It all moved across the Mediterranean in wooden ships, along established routes, through agreed-upon channels of diplomacy and trade. And sitting precisely at the center of all this, at the narrow place where the Aegean Sea tightens into a strait that leads to the Black Sea, was a city with a name that would echo across 3,000 years of human memory. Walusa, called Ilias in Greek, called Troia, called by all the world today simply Troy. The hill of Hisarlik in modern Turkey rises only about 30 meters above the surrounding plain. To look at it today, you might walk past it entirely. It is modest, dusty, unassuming, but beneath that hill, stacked like layers of memory, are the ruins of not one city, but 9, each one built upon the bones of the last. 9 civilizations. 9 attempts at permanence. 9 moments when human beings looked at a piece of land and said, "Here, we build here." The earliest of those cities was founded around 3000 BC to 5 full centuries before the Great Pyramids of Egypt were built. And by the time we arrive at our story, by the time we reach 1200 BC, the city known as Troy VIIA had already seen thousands of years of human life pass through its gates. Archaeologists who have spent decades digging through those layers describe a city that was larger and more impressive than most people imagine. For most of the 20th century, scholars pictured Troy as a modest citadel, a small, fortified hilltop kingdom, perhaps impressive for its time, but not extraordinary. Then, in the 1980s and 1990s, German archaeologist Manfred Korfmann arrived with new tools and a new vision. What he found beneath the soil surrounding that ancient citadel changed everything. Troy was not merely a citadel. It had a lower city, a sprawling, populated, commercially active lower city that extended across a far wider area than anyone had previously understood. New excavations revealed a defensive ditch, a great U-shaped trench cut into the earth outside the walls, designed to stop chariots and armies from approaching. Inside that ditch, houses, storage facilities, workshops. The population of Troy at its height may have reached 5,000 to 10,000 people. In the context of the ancient world, that made Troy not a village with pretensions, but a genuine urban center. A city in the full and proper meaning of that word. Now let us walk into it. It is dawn in the summer of 1200 BC, and the sky above the Dardanelles is a deep, burning gold. The Scamander River, the one Homer will later make legendary, catches the morning light as it winds through the plain below the city. The air smells of smoke from morning fires, of baking bread, of horses and damp earth. The great citadel wall of Troy dominates the hilltop. Its stones are massive, cut and fitted with precision that still impresses archaeologists today. The walls are roughly 5 meters thick in places. The towers rise high enough to see the sea. At the main gates, the south gate, the east gate, the great propylon entrance, guards stand. They wear bronze helmets. They carry spears. But they are not simply soldiers. They are, in a sense, customs officers, because Troy's power was never built entirely on military might. It was built on something far more sustainable and far more profitable: control. Troy controlled the strait. This narrow passage of water, the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, was one of the most strategically valuable geographical features in the ancient world. Every ship sailing from the Aegean to the Black Sea, or returning from the Black Sea to the Aegean, had to pass by this hill. And in the ancient world, the winds at this strait were notoriously difficult. Ships heading north through the strait toward the Black Sea often had to wait days, sometimes weeks, for the prevailing winds to shift in their favor. They anchored. They camped. They waited. And while they waited, they were in Troy's territory. That is the genius of Troy's position. It was not merely a city at a crossroads. It was a toll booth at the most important crossroads in the Bronze Age world. Archaeologist Manfred Korfmann described it bluntly as a pirate fortress, a city that ruled the strait, extracted tribute from passing ships, and grew wealthy on the constant flow of commerce that moved through those narrow blue waters. A Minoan seal found during recent excavations, a small piece of fired clay from Crete, used to endorse official documents, was discovered just outside Troy's south gate, dating to around 1300 BC. One small seal, from an island hundreds of miles away, quietly confirming what the location always suggested, that Troy was not isolated. It was deeply embedded in the international order of its time. Inside the citadel, the elite of Troy lived in multi-story stone houses. These were not primitive huts. They were proper residential buildings, freestanding, constructed of stone, without windows at ground level to discourage break-ins. The architectural style was a distinctive blend. Some buildings followed the classic Greek megaron design, with a large central room built around a hearth. Others had more irregular floor plans, reflecting a cosmopolitan mix of influences from across the Aegean world. It suggests a city where different cultural traditions mingled and merged, where traders from Greece brought their architectural ideas, and local Anatolian craftsmen adapted and incorporated them. Somewhere on the highest terrace of the citadel, there may have been a royal palace. Archaeology has not been able to confirm its precise form. Later construction in the classical era destroyed much of what stood at the highest point. But the logic of Bronze Age city-states leaves little doubt that a seat of royal power existed there. In the Hittite records discovered at the imperial capital Hattusa, the city is referred to as Wilusa, and its king, whatever his actual Bronze Age name may have been, was addressed as a vassal of the great Hittite emperor. One document, known to scholars as the Alexandru Treaty, records an agreement between the Hittite king and a ruler of Wilusa named Alexandru, a name that sounds, in a curious echo across time, very much like Alexandros, which was, of course, the other name of Paris, the Trojan prince at the center of Homer's great story. A coincidence? Perhaps, or perhaps the faintest whisper of a real historical memory buried inside a poem. Below the citadel walls, in the lower city, life was busier and more ordinary. Potters shaped clay on wheels. Weavers worked at looms, producing textiles that would be traded at the harbors below. Metalworkers hammered bronze into tools and weapons. Farmers brought grain in from the fertile plain, and storage pithoi, those enormous, chest-high ceramic jars, were buried in the floors of houses throughout the lower city, filled with supplies against the possibility of a siege. That detail is haunting when you examine it closely. Pithoi buried in the ground. Storage jars dug into the floors of homes, filled to the brim with food, with oil, with grain. Archaeologists found them in remarkable numbers in the Troy Via layer, the city that corresponds most closely to the time of the Trojan War, and which shows clear signs of having been rebuilt hastily after a previous destruction. The people living in that city knew something. They had prepared. They had stockpiled. They were ready, or trying to be ready, for what might come. Were they afraid? The evidence suggests yes. In the lower city and around the walls, archaeologists discovered sling pellets, hundreds of them. Small, shaped stones, the ammunition of ancient warfare. They found bronze arrowheads. They found spearheads more than 3,000 years old, lying in the earth where they fell. Outside the walls, the great ditch, the defensive trench, had been filled in some time before the destruction of Troy via, perhaps by the inhabitants themselves, to deny attackers the ability to use it, perhaps as part of expanding the city's outer defenses. Either way, it is the behavior of a people preparing for conflict. The walls of the citadel were also reinforced in the Troy via period. Stone towers were added. The mud brick breastworks on top of the stone walls were repaired and heightened. The city that Homer described as having well-built walls and lofty gates was not a poet's invention. The walls were real. The towers were real. And the fear that motivated their construction was real too. Let us step back and place Troy in its larger world, because Troy did not exist in isolation. It was one thread in an extraordinary tapestry of Bronze Age civilization, and in 1200 BC, that tapestry was beginning to tear. To the west, across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean civilization of Greece was at the height of its power, and, though no one yet understood it, at the edge of its destruction. The Mycenaeans were a warrior culture of remarkable sophistication. Their palace at Mycenae featured the famous Lion Gate. Their palace at Tiryns had walls so massive that later Greeks could not believe humans had built them, and called them Cyclopean, the work of giants. Their palace at Pylos kept records in a script called Linear B, a form of ancient Greek that modern scholars were only able to decipher in the 1950s. These records detailed everything from grain supplies to the disposition of troops, including, chillingly, a series of orders from the palace at Pylos commanding watchers to guard the coast. Someone was coming. Someone was expected. To the south, in Egypt, Pharaoh Rameses III was fighting for his kingdom's life. Twice, first around 1207 BC and again in 1177 BC, a mysterious coalition of peoples descended on Egypt from the sea. Rameses recorded them on the walls of his great temple at Medinet Habu in scenes of breathtaking detail. Fleets of ships, men in feathered helmets, the chaos of battle. He called them simply the peoples of the sea peoples. Their origins are still debated by scholars. They may have come from the Aegean Islands, from the coast of Anatolia, from Libya, from the collapsing kingdoms of the north. Some scholars have suggested that many of them were refugees, people already displaced by the chaos spreading across the Bronze Age world, washing through civilization like a tide. To the east, the Hittite Empire, Troy's nominal overlord, was unraveling. The great capital Hattusa would be burned and abandoned within a generation. The Hittite king sent a desperate letter to the king of Ugarit, the great port city on the Syrian coast, begging for grain. "It is a matter of life and death," the letter said. The grain never arrived. Ugarit was already burning. The last tablet ever found at Ugarit, a clay document that was literally in the kiln being fired when the city was destroyed, is a letter from a neighboring king to the king of Ugarit, warning him that enemy ships had been spotted offshore. The fires that would destroy Ugarit were probably already visible from the citadel when that letter was written. It was never delivered. This is the world that surrounded Troy in 1200 BC, a world shaking at its foundations. A world in which the great palace economies that had dominated the Mediterranean for 5 centuries were failing one by one, like lamps going out across a darkened room. The causes were many. Scholars have spent decades debating their relative importance, and the honest answer is, there was no single cause. There was a perfect storm. Drought came first. Pollen evidence drawn from lake sediments across the eastern Mediterranean shows a prolonged dry period beginning around 1250 BC. The rains failed, crops failed. The elaborate grain storage systems that Bronze Age palaces depended upon began to run dry. In a world where palace-based redistribution was the economic backbone of entire kingdoms, food shortages cascaded rapidly into political collapse. In Egypt, evidence from the reign of Ramesses III shows that tomb robbers were stealing food, not gold, not treasures, food. People were starving. Then came the earthquakes. Geologists studying fault lines across the Aegean have documented a period of intense seismic activity in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Troy itself showed signs of earthquake damage. Troy VI, the magnificent predecessor of our Troy Vieille, appears to have been brought down primarily by an earthquake around 1300 BC. The survivors rebuilt on the rubble. That is the Troy Vieille that the archaeologists find. A hastily reconstructed city crowded anxious the storage. Jars sunk into every available floor, the walls reinforced with additional towers, the lower city densely packed with new housing as people from the surrounding countryside crowded inside the relative safety of the city walls. Have you ever wondered if the legendary city of Troy was real? The city of King Priam, the mighty warrior Hector, and the beautiful Helen, whose face launched 1,000 ships. For centuries, most people thought it was just a myth, a brilliant story spun by the poet Homer. But what if I told you the city was real, and that its story is even more fascinating, more complex, and more tragic than the legend? Let's travel back in time, not just to the era of heroes and epic battles, but to the very soil of northwestern Turkey, to a low hill overlooking the Dardanelles Strait. This is where, in 1871, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann arrived with a shovel and a lifelong obsession. He was determined to find Homer's Troy, and against all odds, he did. He dug, sometimes recklessly, through layers of history Roman, Greek, and older. Beneath it all, he found the ruins of a mighty Bronze Age citadel. He found gold, pottery, and unmistakable signs of a great fire. He declared he had found the Troy of the Trojan War, and while his methods were crude, he had kicked open a door to a lost world. Later, more careful archaeologists peeled back the layers of time like an onion. They discovered not one city, but at least 10, built one on top of the other over thousands of years. We call them Troy I, Troy II, all the way up to Troy X, or even Troy 0, a settlement so ancient it predates the Egyptian pyramids by a millennium. The city we're most interested in, the one that most closely matches Homer's epic, is known as Troy Vi and Troy Vieille. Troy VI was a magnificent city. Imagine wide, sweeping streets, elegant multi-story houses, and massive sloping limestone walls. It was a rich, confident, cosmopolitan hub, controlling the vital trade route between the Aegean and the Black Sea. This was a city at the height of its power, a key player in the complex world of the Late Bronze Age, trading and sparring with the Hittite Empire to the east and the Mycenaean Greeks to the west. But something changed. Around 1250 BC, a powerful earthquake shattered Troy Vi. The Trojans rebuilt, but the new city, Troy Vieille, was different. The grand houses were subdivided into smaller, crowded dwellings. People crammed themselves inside the citadel walls, digging huge storage jars into the floors to stockpile food and water. The feeling of the city had shifted. The confident, open Troy was gone, replaced by something more desperate, more fearful. This was a city that knew the world was becoming a dangerous place. And what about the war? Homer tells a story of a 10-year siege, a stolen queen, and a wooden horse. Archaeology can't confirm a beautiful queen named Helen or a hero like Achilles. But it confirms something just as dramatic. Around 1180 BC, Troy Vieille was destroyed. Violently. Archaeologists found arrowheads embedded in the streets, unburied skeletons in the ruins of houses, and a thick layer of ash and rubble from a massive fire. One skeleton found near a gate had clear marks of a violent death, a silent witness to the city's final, chaotic moments. So, who destroyed it? Was it the Achaean Greeks from Homer's Iliad? We can't be 100% sure, but the clues are tantalizing. Hittite records from that period mention a powerful kingdom called Ahiawau, which most scholars identify as the Mycenaean Greeks, causing trouble in this exact region, which they called Wailusa, a name incredibly similar to the Greek Ilias, another name for Troy. So, at the very least, we know Greeks and Trojans were rivals, and likely in conflict, during the same period as the legendary war. Many historians now believe the Trojan War wasn't a single 10-year conflict, but a compressed memory. A grand story woven from decades, or even centuries, of raids, trade disputes, and rising tension between the Greek world and the powers of Anatolia. As the entire Bronze Age civilization began to buckle under the strain of climate change, famine, and mass migrations, these conflicts likely intensified until they were eventually gathered up by storytellers and polished into the single unforgettable epic of the Iliad. Name of one city, Troy, came to represent the fall of an entire age. And what a fall it was. The destruction of Troy wasn't an isolated event. It was a domino falling in a much longer line. This period is known as the Bronze Age collapse, one of the darkest and most mysterious chapters in human history. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the world's great civilizations fell apart with shocking speed. The Hittite Empire vanished. The great palaces of Mycenaean Greece, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns were burned and abandoned. The bustling port city of Ugarit in Syria was destroyed and never reoccupied. It was a systems collapse. International trade routes dissolved. Entire writing systems, like the Greeks' Linear B script, disappeared so completely that people forgot they had ever existed. For the next 400 years, Greece plunged into a dark age. Populations plummeted. Cities shrank into small villages, and the brilliant, interconnected world of the Bronze Age became a distant, half-remembered dream. It was from the embers of this dark age, about 400 years after the city fell, that a poet we call Homer began to sing. He was looking back across a vast gulf of time, trying to reconstruct a lost world from fragments of memory passed down through generations. And what's incredible is how much he got right. He described the wide streets of Troy, its lofty gates, the topography of the plain, the location of the river's details that fit the Bronze Age city, not his own 8th century world. He was a historical detective, using poetry to unearth a memory buried under centuries of silence. So let's stand one last time on those ancient walls. Look out as the sun sets over the Aegean. Imagine not ruins, but a living city. Merchants hauling goods up from the harbor, guards changing at the gates, the smell of cooking fires, the sounds of children playing. These people didn't think of themselves as characters in a myth. They were real. They lived, they loved, they feared, and they fought to protect their world, a world they believed would last forever. Their city fell. Their civilization collapsed. But their story, through a unique combination of archaeology and poetry, has survived for over 3,000 years. The tale of Troy isn't just about a legendary war. It's about resilience, memory, and the incredible power of a story to keep a lost world alive. It reminds us that even when cities turn to dust and empires fall, the human voice can echo through eternity. Thanks so much for watching. If you're fascinated by the mysteries of the ancient world, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more journeys into the past. See you next time. The hill of Hissarlik is not finished giving up its secrets. Here's what we know. Here's what the evidence tells us, stripped of poetry and legend. In 1200 BC, on a strategically positioned hill at the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait in northwestern Anatolia, there existed a city of several thousand people. It had massive stone walls, multiple gates, a citadel on the highest point with elite residential buildings, and a populous lower city defended by a great external ditch. It was connected by trade and diplomacy to civilizations across the entire Mediterranean world, to Mycenaean Greece, to Minoan Crete, to the Hittite Empire, to Egypt. It controlled one of the most valuable geographical positions in the ancient world. It was wealthy, sophisticated, and anxious, its people storing supplies in buried jars, reinforcing their walls, watching the horizons. And then, sometime around 1180 to 1190 BC, it burned. The destruction layer of Troy VIIA contains evidence of fire and violence. It contains unburied human remains. It contains arrowheads and spearheads. And then, above the destruction, people came back. The survivors, or perhaps new settlers, built again on the ruins of the burnt city, this time in a different style, with pottery that shows different cultural influences. The material culture shifts in a way that suggests the population changed. The people who built Troy VIIB were not entirely the same people who had lived in Troy VIA. What happened in between those two layers? What happened in the ash and rubble of Troy VIA's destruction? Nobody knows. Not entirely. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the greatest city of the ancient world deserves to keep at least a few of its secrets. The world of 1200 BC, in almost every meaningful sense, as foreign to us as another planet. There were no smartphones, no nation-states, no internet, no satellites, no antibiotics. The wheel was not new. It had been known for 2,000 years. Writing existed, but only for specialists. Palace scribes and royal administrators who used it to track grain and taxes, not yet for literature or personal expression. The average person lived in a world bounded by the distance they could walk in a day, governed by rhythms of seasons, and harvests and the movements of a sky they had never seen maps of. And yet, the people of Troy in 1200 BC were entirely recognizably human. They loved their children. They feared their enemies. They built their walls higher when they felt threatened. They stored food against uncertain times. They traded across enormous distances with people they had never met, trusting in agreed-upon systems of commerce and diplomacy that had evolved over centuries. They created art and beauty and architecture and ritual. They built a city in a spectacular location, and they defended it with everything they had. They also lived in a world whose complexity and interconnection made it fragile in ways they could not fully understand. The drought that dried up their grain supply had begun 500 miles away, in shifting atmospheric patterns that no person in the Bronze Age had the tools to comprehend. The sea peoples who swept through the Mediterranean were themselves refugees from collapsing systems, driven from their own homes by the same cascading failures. The whole edifice of Bronze Age civilization, that extraordinary intricate 5 centuries-old web of trade and diplomacy and specialized production, was a system so tightly wound, so dependent on every part functioning, that when the first threads began to pull loose, the whole thing unraveled faster than anyone could stop it. We call it the Bronze Age collapse, a clinical academic term for what was, for the people who lived through it, the end of their world. Their cities burned. Their writing systems disappeared. Their palaces fell. Their trade routes went silent. And the accumulated knowledge, the refined techniques, the complex social arrangements that had taken 500 years to build, gone. Not in a century, not even in a generation, in decades. In the space of a single human lifetime, a civilization that had seemed eternal ceased to exist. And on the hill of Hisarlik, above the plain of Troy, the ruins settled into the earth. Weeds grew over the walls. Wind filled the empty houses. The fires went out, and the world that those walls had once protected, the world of merchants and warriors and priests and potters, and children playing in the lower city, passed into silence. 400 years of silence. 400 years, until a blind poet, sitting somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, opened his mouth and began to sing. Asterisk, sing in me muse, and through me tell the story. Asterisk, could this be what Troy really looked like? Stand on the hill of Hisarlik today. Look across the plain to where the Dardanelles glitters in the distance. The sea is still there. The wind is still there. The plain is still there, with the silver thread of the Scamander River winding through it. And somewhere beneath your feet, if you stand in exactly the right place, the stones of Troy VIIA are still there too. 3,200 years under the earth. Patient, silent, real. What they tell us, what archaeology and Hittite records and Homer's own echoing words tell us together, is that Troy was not a myth. It was a place. It was a city. It was home to thousands of real human beings who loved their lives and lost them, who built something extraordinary on that hill and watched it burn, who, in their fear and hope and ordinary daily courage, were not so very different from the people who walk this earth today. The world of 1200 BC is gone. Every palace, every archive, every king, gone. But the story survived. And sometimes a story is the only kind of wall that never truly falls, because civilizations leave behind ruins. But the truly great ones leave behind something stronger. They leave behind questions. Questions that pull us 3,000 years later, back to a dusty hill in Turkey, still searching, still digging, still asking. Asterisk, what really happened here? Asterisk, and perhaps the most profound thing about the forgotten world of 1200 BC, is not that it disappeared, but that despite everything, despite 3 millennia of silence and ruin and forgetting, we are still trying to remember it. Because somewhere deep in the human heart, we understand that the people who built those walls were not strangers to us. They were us. And the world they lost, its beauty, its fragility, its terrible and sudden ending, is a mirror that, if we dare to look into it, shows us something not about the distant past, but about ourselves, and about every civilization that has ever believed its walls were high enough to last forever.